Hello everyone, it's Stuart Room here and welcome back to my channel on everything to do with data protection, privacy and security. So I hope you're well. We're living in truly uncertain times, really scary for all of us, worried about the welfare of our friends, our family, our nearest, our dearest, what's going to happen in our countries, what's happening in the economy. And this isn't a video about coronavirus, COVID-19, but the reason I have this here today, obviously part of a natural healthcare procedure right now, but really to start to move the conversation into what I think is a really critical point within the data protection field, which is about the role that ethics have to play in the environment. And as I've been developing the script for this video, I've been thinking more about the question of ethics in broader society, and potentially we're on the cusp, perhaps, of asking more deeper ethical questions about what it is we want to do in society and what our society is about. For instance, the climate crisis. What's that conversation going to look like post-coronavirus? Nuclear weapons, what's that conversation going to look like? But as far as data protection is concerned, the coronavirus sheds massive light on a very, very significant issue in the environment and any significant gap in the data protection world. So here's a little portrait of how the ethics issue has played out in the data protection environment over the past couple of weeks in the context of the coronavirus. So I read some articles 2 weeks ago where data protection experts were basically advising businesses not to track their employees, their workforces, to be very, very cautious about the processing of personal data, because that could lead to a data protection infringement, a privacy infringement. A couple of weeks further forward, and we're reading about very significant tracking apps that are developing that in China are potentially being used for, or could be used for, wider surveillance and suppression of minorities. And between these 2 points, we have don't track, absolute tracking. What is the right thing to do? So I was discussing this with one of my mates, a leading privacy champion, and he put it perfectly. What good are privacy rights when you're dead? Now, data protection is seen primarily as a legal idea in the sense that data protection activities are regulated by law. That is absolutely the case, but there's much more to data protection than a regulatory environment. There's an operational environment as well. There's also the question about what is the right thing to do. And this is how we can move forward into trying to understand the relationship, on the one hand, of law and on the other hand of ethics. So laws are sets of norms that society subscribes to that are pushed into our environment via a government, a parliament, an executive, even a dictator in some situations. And they standardise behaviours. They tell us what we can do and what we cannot do. And there is a sanction that is applied for breach of law. It could be criminal sanction, or it might be some civil liability, for example, if we breach contract law. Ethics are part of moral philosophy. It's about what is the right thing to do for us as human beings, us individually. But actually, in a westernized democracy, the law should codify and standardize ethical positions, in the sense that we are all a voice inside the democracy, and the political institutions reflect our will. They come to us in general elections. We say yes, we say no. And what we have in our legal environment is a codification of morals. So when we look at it in that way, we can see law and ethics working perfectly well together. Yin and yang, flip sides of the same coin. Law has a huge amount of white space within it. So if you were to get the GDPR out, yes, there are dozens of articles, lots of detail, but they don't really guide us on how to behave in specific situations. There is no section inside the GDPR about coronavirus, that there's nothing in there. We know that we should obey the data protection principles, minimization, accuracy. Minimization would prevent oversharing. But on the other hand, we know that the data protection regime allows departure from the data protection principles. It permits invasions of privacy in circumstances of wider public concern, wider public good. So we can process data for national security purposes to protect us from harm. We can process data for law enforcement purposes to protect us from villainy. We can process personal data for public health. And there's the white space. What is the right thing to do with the processing and sharing of personal data in the corona situation? What's the advice to business? What's the advice to government? What's the advice to a hospital that wants to work with a technology company for data analytics purposes, to understand the nature of the virus? The data protection regime will permit, in a conceptual sense, activities to allow considerable invasion of privacy spaces. But what's the right thing to do? And that's where ethics comes in. Ethics helps us to understand that we need to home in on the question, what is the right thing to do? So I see this white space issue within law as a considerable point. It helps us to understand there's a gap in thinking that needs to be filled, and therefore the question is how do we fill the gap? So this white space issue is really significant if we want to understand the role of ethics. But law has other challenges within it that take us to ethical questions. So for instance, law is politicised. We've spoken about that just before. Law is very often nationalised. Law is a command. It's a compulsion, comes from the top. It may not transcend all barriers. Why should one country agree with another country's laws? When we've got philosophical challenges at geopolitical level, how can we ensure that good ideas flow everywhere? So law's got these problems. It's got these inherent problems, nationalistic, paternalistic, politicised. And for those reasons, there are natural limitations on the longevity and scalability of laws. Ethics doesn't work like that. Ethics comes from the bottom up. Ethics is not politicised. It's looking at a different set of questions. Ethics comes from a corpus of opinions that meld together. And where we see idea of ethics, the really sustained past national barriers, sustained past time, generations of time. We see, for instance, the Hippocratic Oath in medicine. We see the legal duty of client confidentiality. That these things have been around for, in the first case, thousands of years. And they survive time and politics. Because ethics is really looking at something else. And law and ethics working together isn't new. It's not new at all. The data protection field doesn't need to be afraid of the ethical question coming to prominence. When I was a trainee lawyer, undergraduate days at university, I studied law and medical ethics as one of my electives. And there were tomes, legal texts that were in 8th, 9th, 10th edition about this subject matter. And 30 years on, I saw one of the leading textbooks being republished. So there's a huge amount to draw upon. We don't need to be afraid, if we're data protection professionals, of ethics being part of our debate. And I flagged this, and I'll come back to it in a moment, but there is some noise in the environment about regulators should not be involved in questions of ethics, and I fundamentally disagree with that point of view. So, a little rule of thumb, the more complicated something is, the newer it is, the more complex, the more things it affects, the more people it affects. These are all good reasons to bring the ethical challenge into the environment. So we shouldn't be surprised that the government sets up the Centre for Data Ethics in the context of AI, artificial intelligence, because of its complexity, its novelty, its importance to society. You see, law by itself is elite. There's an elitism within it, an exceptionalism. It is just for lawyers. Ethics takes account of this wider point of view. So let me home in a little bit more on this idea of data protection and questions of ethics being connected. They live together, they work together. If you look at the first data protection principle, it says that data processing shall be fair and lawful. Transparency has been added to the principle through the GDPR, but let's look at the first word, fair. Fair. Isn't fairness an ethical question? And let's remind ourselves of the issues within data protection that we're trying to work through. Automated facial recognition, profiling, automated decision-taking, wider use of biometrics, personalisation. Look at industry activities, ad tech, real-time bidding. The coronavirus, of course, brings the ethical issue right into relief. But data protection in the modern world raises ethical questions every single day. And the white space inside the GDPR is not going to be filled simply with a legalistic point of view. So businesses really need to engage with the ethical questions of data protection. Data protection, privacy, is a trust issue, it's a confidence issue, it's a gain issue. Data processing should serve humankind. We just get so much out of it. I think that business will increase its innovation, it will deliver on its purpose, it will achieve more sustainable growth if it takes account of ethics. I absolutely believe this. It is the place where businesses now need to go. And just a few thoughts about the question of data protection regulators entering the ethics space. There is criticism of the UK Information Commissioner's Office for taking an ethical point of view. I don't believe these critics are right. The regulators have to be in the ethical space. I actually believe it would be a breach of the inherent duties in data protection legislation if regulators were not looking at ethical issues. I really do believe that. I think that case can be made legally. I'd be confident about making that case. Of course, when it comes to questions of enforcement of the law and the application of penalties, the data protection regulators have really got to be mindful of their statutory duties, their statutory powers, and the wider legal environment that applies to regulatory and public law. Of course, that's what I do for a living. But regulators need to be in the ethical space. And I applaud the regulators who are actually leading on all of this. They should be encouraged because ultimately we need to do the right thing on data protection, as the coronavirus has illustrated. So I hope you found the video interesting. Thanks ever so much for watching. If you liked it, can you give me a like, press the bell to subscribe and be kept up to date on new content. And really hope you stay well and fit, positive and happy. And you've got people around you to support you in these really difficult times. In order to help our clients and contacts, we're going virtual with our data protection forum at DWF. So contact me on the email address below. The next forum is on the 7th of April. And we're going to look at all the data protection issues in the retail space. And after that, on the 5th of May, we're going to start looking at data protection issues, privacy and security issues in the context of financial services. So if you're at home going stir crazy, well, at least there's going to be a community that you can take part in virtually. Got any questions about ethics? Reach out. I'm really, really interested in it. And don't forget to wash your hands.